Without further delay, let us get straight on to the first session entitled Impact of Brexit Uncertainty on UK Trade After the Referendum. I'm going to chair this, which is convenient because I've already introduced myself and did the housekeeping. So for this session, we are going to have about 45 minutes until 10 to 3 local time. And so it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speakers for this session. Michael Gasiorek is a professor of economics at the University of Sussex, a very active fellow of UKTPO, as well as managing director of Interanalysis, a university spin-out company. Michael's a specialist in international trade, regional integration, and ever since the referendum, trade issues around Brexit. He has worked on the importance of engagement in international value chains and has applied his considerable modeling skills, both general and partial equilibrium, in this area. He's published widely in academic journals, and he has also delivered many trade-related training courses. Bernard Hoekman, who will be the discussant in this session, is professor at the European University Institute in Florence and director of the Global Governance Program at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies at the EUI. He has worked at the World Bank for many years, including as director of its International Trade Department. And in a nutshell, he is simply one of the most eminent scholars on trade policy and governance today. Thank you both very much for being in this session. And with this, Michael, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ingo, and thank you very much to all the participants who are online and hopefully listening, and hopefully you can hear me quite clearly. So without much ado, I'm going to switch to sharing my screen so that you can see my slides. So the title of this work is The Impact of Brexit Uncertainty on UK Trade After the Referendum. I should say that this is joint work with Niccolò Tamberi, who's also at the UK Trade Policy Observatory, and this is work in progress. And what we want to do here is to give you a flavour of some of the results that we're working on at the moment and of where we've got to with this work at this point. So to introduce the topic, we know that the Brexit referendum occurred in June 2016, and at that moment in time, there were no formal changes in tariffs or non-tariff barriers between the UK and the EU, but clearly uncertainty increased. Uncertainty regarding the future of UK-EU trade policy, and in particular the possibility of future tariffs with the EU and possibly with the FTA partners, i.e. those countries with whom the EU and therefore the UK had a free trade agreement with. And in the months and years after the referendum, the no deal possibility has always been kept alive by the British government, and indeed is still being kept alive as we speak. So the question we are addressing in the work we're doing here is, we're trying to consider whether we can find, or what evidence we can find as to whether UK's trade reacted to that uncertainty about what that future trade regime might be. So we're explicitly interested in the impact of uncertainty on trade. Two related pieces of work on this. First, the work of Graziano Handling in Mauer 2018. They used 6-digit product level data. So for those of you not familiar with trade classification schemes, that covers about 5,500 products. They were looking at the pre-referendum period. One of the ways that they included a measure of Brexit uncertainty was looking at bet odds, the odds that betting companies were offering on the probability of a deal or no deal and so on, or of leaving, rather of the referendum going for or against leaving the EU. And what they find is a negative effect on bilateral trade with the EU, both on the intensive and on the extensive margins. Let me just be clear here, just in case people aren't clear, what I mean by the intensive and extensive margin. So by the intensive margin, I'm thinking, well, what one is capturing there is whether there's any increase in trade or decrease in trade that was already taking place. So if products were already being traded to the EU earlier on in the period as a result of the referendum, or as a result of the uncertainty, I should say, did that trade increase or decrease. So that's the intensive margin. The extensive margin, in contrast, is looking at whether new products were traded, whether there were new goods being introduced into trade, or if products were being dropped, so less products were being traded. And we're going to be looking at both the intensive and extensive margin in our work, which is why it's important to make that clear. The other relevant paper is that of Meredith Crowley et al., also from 2018. As opposed to using product level data, they used firm level data at an even more disaggregated level, the CN8. And they considered the period immediately after the referendum. And they measured uncertainty by using the MFN tariff that UK firms would face if there was a no-deal exit. So clearly, if the worry for one of the worries for firms as a result of leaving the EU is likely to be the tariffs that they may subsequently end up facing on exports to the EU in the event of there being no deal. The bigger is that possible tariff, the bigger is that threat, and the greater, if you like, the uncertainty associated with a no deal for those firms. Clearly, if there was no tariffs for those goods for which there are no tariffs on exports to the EU, then that threat doesn't exist, at least the tariff element of that threat. So what Crowley finds is a negative impact of uncertainty again. They focus entirely on the extensive margin, so on whether there are new products being exported by firms to the EU or if there's any dropping of products. And they find that there would have been entry would have been 5% higher or 6.1% lower if the referendum had gone the other way. So what we do is to measure the impact of no-deal Brexit uncertainty on UK goods trade, and we're looking at the period 2015 to 2019. So we're looking at a much longer time period than those preceding two papers. We look at two groups of partners. We're looking at UK trade with the EU27, and we're going to have two bits of analysis I'm going to show you here. There's going to be a more short-run analysis, which looks at the first 6 months after the referendum, and then a longer-run analysis that looks at the period 2017 to 19, in fact, 2015 to 19. The second group of partners that we want to look at is UK trade with the FTA partners. So as I said earlier, these are the countries that the EU has free trade agreements with, and as a member of the EU, the UK was clearly a member of those free trade agreements, and there was an element of uncertainty with regard to the future future management of trade and future trade agreements with those FTA partners. So that's another group of countries that we want to consider. A little bit on how to measure uncertainty. Two ways that one can think about doing this. One is by using the height of the MFN tariff that would be faced in the event of a no deal, and I've already described that a little bit. Graziano Handling and Lemauer also looked at those bet odds. Instead of using bet odds, another way of thinking about measuring uncertainty is to use Google searches on terms such as Brexit no deal, withdrawal agreement, and so on, and to look at the amount of those searches that are taking place in Google and to derive an index from that, and that sort of data is also available. We have done a little bit of work using the Google index. I may not have time to share that with you, but if I do, I will say a little bit about that as well. Worth briefly reminding you of the Brexit timeline. It's surprising how easily and quickly one forgets these things. Well, maybe I should just speak for myself, but the actual time of when things occurred. So obviously the referendum occurred in 2016 in June. The next major date in those was March 2017, which is when Theresa May triggered Article 50. And if you remember, the triggering of Article 50 in March 2017 meant that our leave date, the UK's leave date, became March 2019. So it was around March 2019 that there was considerable uncertainty as to whether or not the UK would leave at that point. And in the end, on the 20th of March, the UK requested an extension of Article 50, which was finally agreed until October 2019. So one big period of uncertainty was around March 2019. The second period of uncertainty was around October 2019, when the Brexit deal was lost in the House of Commons. The Prime Minister requested an extension, which was then given up until January 2020. And as we know, we left on at the end of January 2020, and the transition period will end at the end of this year. So let me turn to the first bit of analysis, which is where we're looking at trade between the UK and the EU 27. We're going to use trade data, or we're using trade data at the HS 6-digit level, and we're using the EU MFN tariff as our proxy for a measure of uncertainty. What we're doing in this first bit of analysis is to take the products that were traded between the UK and the EU in the second half of 2015 and compare that to the products traded in the second half of 2016. So the estimating equation here is this change, and we're going to, this YIV, I is the country to which the product is being exported to, the EU country, and V is the product, i.e. the variety. So we're looking at changes in the products being exported to the EU. And those changes that we will look at are both the changes at the intensive margin and also at the extensive margin, as I explained and defined earlier. And we want to see whether those changes, whether uncertainty, which is this term here, UV, impacted on those trade flows. The way we're measuring uncertainty here derives from the work of Handling and Limauer 2015 paper, which gives this term as a measure of MFN risk. Okay? So this tau V here encapsulates the tariff, the MFN tariff that firms might face, and the sigma is the elasticity of substitution. We have used just the tariff on its own. We've done some equivalent regressions with just the tariff on its own, which is more closely similar to what Meredith Crowley did, and the results, significance and sign, are very consistent with what I'm going to present to you here. The second thing that we do, as opposed to just looking at UK trade to the EU, I mean, for example, it might be there was a decline in world demand for a given product or so on. So there might be other confounding factors in here. So the second thing that we do is to compare UK exports to the EU with UK exports to the OECD. So if you like, this first procedure that we use is a classic difference and difference, diff and diff analysis. Here we're doing a triple diff and diff because we're also looking at UK exports. We're comparing the change in UK exports to the EU with the UK exports to the OECD. So you can think of that being the UK exports to the OECD as being a control on this. But we only want to include those OECD countries that the EU does not have a free trade agreement with, because obviously there's uncertainty with regard to the free trade agreement countries as well. And those non-FTA OECD countries are Australia, Canada, Japan, New Zealand, and the US. So if I turn to the first set of results, you will see in this table that I've, and this will be true of the subsequent tables, I've got results for exports and for imports. And with regard to each of those, I've got results for the extensive margin and the intensive margin. So this set of results is for this first specification here, where we're just looking at UKEU 27 trade. What we find is no significance with regard to imports, and the one significant result that we find here is a significant result on the extensive margin. So an increase in uncertainty reduces trade on the extensive margin, reduces the probability, think of this as reducing the probability of exporting to the EU. If I now move to the second specification, which is the triple difference and difference, which compares the UK to the EU 27 versus the UK to the OECD. And again, remember, this is a comparison between the second half of 2015 and the second half of 2016. Once again, on the import side, there's nothing significant that comes out. If you look at this second row here, where we're interacting the uncertainty variable with whether or not the country is an EU country or not, once again, we see that an increase in uncertainty is associated with a decrease in the probability of exporting. Interestingly, we also find an increase in trade at the intensive margin to the OECD non-FTA countries. Okay, if I move on to the next bit of analysis where we're looking at a slightly longer term period, we're now looking at the period, sorry, let me just minimize that. I realize that might have been in your way. We're now looking at the period 2017 to 2019, and we're now using yearly data. So for the preceding analysis, because we're using half-yearly data, we needed to use monthly data to aggregate up those half-yearly. Now we're just looking at yearly data, and we've got the period from, in fact, 2015 to 2019. So 2015 is the base year, and we're doing classic panel level regression where we're asking whether trade changed. So again, now I've got this on the left-hand side here, I've got YITV. So this is for country I in period T or in year T for product V. We're looking how trade, be it at the extensive or the intensive margin, changed over time. And we're looking at whether uncertainty, this UV term, impacted on that trade, and we're interacting that with the Brexit variable, okay, i.e. with the referendum variable having left after 2015. So that Brexit variable is 0 in the year 2015 and 1 in the period afterwards to capture whether leaving the EU and uncertainties associated with lower trade. And as before, we do this directly by looking at UKEU 27 and also by comparing the trade with the EU 27 and the non-FTA OECD countries. Now, out of those non-FTA OECD countries, in that period, Canada and Japan signed an FTA in that period. Therefore, we also add an interaction to allow for those countries. So now, essentially, we've got 3 of these terms. The middle one of which is capturing the impact on trade with the EU. The first one is capturing the impact on trade with of uncertainty on trade post the referendum with the OECD countries, and the third term with those that signed an FTA. So once again, let me turn to the results. They take the same format as before. I've got both exports and imports, and I'm giving results on both the extensive and the intensive margin. So here, this is again that first specification where we're just looking at trade with the EU. And here we see we do get, now we're getting some significant coefficients on imports, which suggests that uncertainty impacted negatively on the extensive margin and a bit positively on the intensive margin. But let me caveat this immediately by saying that we found that these results aren't very particularly robust alternative specifications, so I wouldn't draw too much inference from these. Let me move on to what I think is the more interesting and better specification, which is this triple difference and difference, where we're comparing what the UK does to the EU with what the UK does to the OECD countries. And here, if you look at this middle, if you look at this middle row here, first on the extensive margin and then on the intensive margin, once again, you can see that Brexit uncertainty appeared to reduce the probability of exporting, so had a negative impact on the extensive margin, and reduced the level of exports, so had a negative impact on the intensive margin. And interestingly, we see a rise in trade on both the extensive and the intensive margin with the OECD FTA partner countries. So the next thing that we do, moving to the third bit of the analysis, is to look at UK trade with the FTA partners. So the UK government was very keen to replace the existing EU FTAs with what it calls the trade continuity agreements, because Brexit threatened that preferential access, because as we left the EU, we would also leave those FTAs, so it wanted to get continuity with that. And some partners replicated existing agreements, others preferred waiting until knowing what would be the outcome between the UK and the EU. To date, 20 of these TCAs have been signed and 19 are under discussion, and Japan has just been announced last week. What we do here is consider the 15 main FTA partners, which account for about 12% of UK's exports and about 16% of imports in 2019. Once again, we're interested in the impact of uncertainty. So the fact that there was uncertainty as to the future relationship with these FTA partner countries should, what we're seeking to see is, did that have a negative impact on trade? But given that the TCAs were signed, what we're then interested in is, did the TCAs, the signing of the TCAs, then have a positive impact on trade? So those TCAs should remove that uncertainty, and we should be able to pick that up in the data. These are the countries that we're looking at, and you can see in this last column when these trade continuity agreements were signed, and they were all signed in different months in 2019. So what that means is that we need to use monthly data, and we're going to be using monthly data for 3 years, 2015, 17, and 19. So 2015 is the base year where there is no uncertainty. 2017 is 1 year after the referendum, so this is where the uncertainty has kicked in and should impact negatively on trade. 2019 is when the TCAs are signed, but in various different months, and the uncertainty is resolved. So we're going to use that monthly data element. The specification is actually very similar to what I had before. It just looks a little bit more complicated because there's this change in 24 sign here. All that is saying is that we're computing the change in trade over 2-year periods. So we're looking at the change in trade between January 15 and January 17, February 15 to February 17, and so on, all the way to December 17 to December 19. Okay, so it's the same idea as before, looking at the change in trade over those two-year periods. So essentially, what happened between 15 and 17 when there was uncertainty, and what happened between 17 and 19 when there was a resolution of that uncertainty. And now our measure of uncertainty is measured by the potential increase in tariffs that the firms could face if the TCAs weren't signed, which would mean there would be a shift from the current preferential tariffs to MFN tariffs. I'm going to skip this slide. Oh, no, I'm not going to skip this slide. Sorry. I realized that I took out a slide which I was going to skip, so I don't need to tell you that I'm going to skip it. So what we've got here is that specification. And interestingly, on the import side, the level of the tariff here, we get some odd coefficients because it suggests the higher is the tariff, the greater is trade, and we need to look into that a little bit more. But what is more interesting is here on the import side, where we're looking at both the extensive and the intensive margin. So what we see here is that post-referendum in the uncertainty period, we had a decline in the probability of trade in the extensive margin, and uncertainty decreasing trade on the intensive margin. Once the TCAs were signed, we see a reversal of these signs. So signing those trade continuity agreements appears to have reversed that uncertainty and increased the probability of exporting and increased the value of trade. Finally, let me spend 2 or 3 minutes on using the Google index as a measure of uncertainty. Essentially, what we did here was to construct 2 indices, which you can think of as a bad news index and a good news index. The bad news index picks up on terms such as no deal, Brexit tariffs, and so on. The good news index picks up on terms in Google such as EU-UK deal and so on. So what we're trying to do is to collect monthly data on these search terms in Google, use these to create an index, and you can see these indices here. So if you like, the bad news index is this blue line, the red line is the good news index, and you can see around those times that I was showing you earlier, you get a spike for the bad news and a spike for the good news around the time of the deal being agreed or possibly being agreed. Final 2 slides. This is just going to give a summary of the results with, summary of the results with this Google Trends Index. And what's most interesting here is to look at those 2 circled things at the bottom, which gives the cumulative effect of bad news. I say cumulative because you will see here that because we're using monthly data for this analysis, we also introduce some lags. The impact may not have been instantaneous. It might have happened a month or 2 later. And we see that the cumulative effect of the bad news index is to reduce exports and imports. The cumulative effect of the good news, wherever there was good news, would have been to increase exports and imports. So let me conclude and give you a summary of our results. What we find is in that short-term period, in terms of trade with the EU, 6 months after the referendum, we find a negative impact of uncertainty on the extensive margin of exports and possibly some increased exports towards OECD non-FTA countries. Taking a longer time period, once again, we see evidence of uncertainty leading to a decline in exports, both in the extensive and the intensive margin, and again, some evidence of an increase in exports to non-FTA OECD countries, which incidentally, for those of you who are on the session yesterday, is also consistent with the sorts of results that Facundo Albornoz was sharing with us with regard to his Argentinian data. When we look at UK trade with the FTA partners, interestingly, we find no effect on exports, but on imports, there appears to be a negative effect of the referendum on both the intensive and the extensive margin, but that's offset by the trade continuity agreements. And finally, once again, work with the Google index appears to suggest that uncertainty does impact negatively on trade. Increased uncertainty appears to impact negatively on trade, and conversely with good news. Okay, I'm probably over my time limit, so I should stop talking now, stop sharing my screen, and hand over to Bernard. Thank you.
Okay, so I guess I should just jump in. So let me do that. So it's a really interesting paper to read, and I encourage everyone to have a look at this. It's obviously a very important question, which is not just of relevance to the United Kingdom and what is the implications of Brexit and how Brexit was actually managed or mismanaged, but I think it is a much more general question that relates to, okay, what are the effects of trade policy, uncertainty on trade? So I'm going to have a few remarks, which clearly this is work in progress, and there's quite a bit, I think, at the front end and also in terms of motivation that currently is missing. So some of my remarks will pertain to that dimension. So I think one thing that's important to recognize up front is this is only about trade in goods, right? And certainly for the United Kingdom, trade in services is very important. And that is, of course, not something that can be addressed with the methodology and the data that is used in the paper, but I think it's important to kind of keep that in mind and mention that up front. I think the strongest part of the paper in terms of finding results is this result, which has to do with what was the effect of signing these trade continuity agreements, because I think there is a very clear question, and there's a pretty clear answer in terms of this actually we see an effect on trade there. I think one of the problems I have with the paper, and I think that as you go about kind of finalizing it, one of the things the paper does, it kind of jumps right into the analysis. It doesn't really provide much of a conceptual framework or a theoretical framework to try and think through where would we expect to see effects, on what margins are those effects likely to occur. So the paper just kind of presumes that, you know, trade is the appropriate variable to look at here, and trade will be kind of the variable that gets adjusted as a result of the risk of confronting higher MFN tariffs, right? So I think that is something that I think needs a bit more of elaboration, essentially answering the question, why and where should we expect to see these types of effects that are related to the potential threat of confronting higher MFN tariffs if everything breaks down and no agreement is reached. Now, when Michael was presenting, you know, at some point in the paper, there's continuous use of this measure of uncertainty, which is a function of the potential MFN tariffs that partners will confront. But once in a while, we also use the term risk, right? And I think it would be more appropriate to think about what is the downside risk associated with potentially confronting higher MFN tariffs. And that's really what the paper is focusing on, it's not so much a measure of uncertainty per se, and I'll come back to that at the end of my comments. Now, before I read this paper, and if you just ask me, or if you were to ask me, where would I expect to see effects as a result of uncertainty with respect to what the state of play is going to be post-Brexit for firms, I would have speculated that you're going to see most of those effects on investment. Now, you're not going to see that immediately on trade, partly because adjusting trade is difficult. And what you can do is, if you were planning to invest in the UK, you might rethink that and say, well, maybe we should be investing in the EU or in other markets, right? So I would suggest looking more and at least discussing, right? This is not something the paper necessarily is doing, and clearly they don't have the data to do it. But I think this investment dimension is an important thing to think about in terms of where would you expect to see effects. And I think that potential investment response to the uncertainty is going to be associated with what type of products are being produced and therefore traded. So I think another dimension that could usefully be explored more is the variation across products, because clearly we have different type of products that are traded, and some of those products might, the firms that produce those products, or the firms that rely on imports of those products in partner countries or in the UK, might have very different incentives to try and deal with the uncertainty, in particular in the short run, depending on what type of products we're talking about. So if products are durable, if products can be stockpiled, some of what seem to be kind of counterintuitive results in the paper in terms of trade increasing when you might expect it to fall, it really could be a function of hedging activity and the opportunity to do that, which doesn't exist if we have perishable products, for example. So I think disentangling and trying to characterize the typology of products might help disentangle some of the effects. So I think, to reiterate, I think the paper will really benefit from more of a theoretical framework up front, which includes effects or expected effects on uncertainty on both the location of production, so that's the investment story, but also on the incentives for firms and consumers of either sourcing or selling products into a particular market, disentangling this typology of products. So digging a bit into, we have different types of products where we expect to see ex ante different effects. And I think there again, more of a theoretical structure would help you identify where you expect to see certain types of effects, and then you can actually test them and see whether we see that in the data. And again, all of that to kind of focus on the first order question, explain why we would or would not expect to see effects, and try and identify ex ante where and how those play out. Now, as I already mentioned, really the core feature of the analysis revolves around this measure of uncertainty, which is really a measure of the potential downside risk of confronting MFN tariffs where currently you have preferences. And I think that makes a lot of sense, but it's not clear to me that necessarily is, the measure of what the downside could be. And we've read a lot about the potential implications of the UK kind of going its own route with respect to regulation of product standards, of technical barriers, of phytosanitary measures, etc. So you could very easily conceive of a situation, and this brings me back to the importance, I think, of looking at different types of products, where some products are very regulation intensive. So if you don't satisfy the regulation of the importing market, or if you lose equivalence status, if you don't have mutual recognition anymore, essentially that could act as a quota or a prohibition, right? So it could be much worse than what the MFN tariff might be. And I think that's important to take into account in terms of what the effects might be of a breakdown, or where you don't have a trade agreement in place. So this regulation dimension is something I think worth thinking about, and maybe looking at what are regulation intensive products as opposed to products where there's less of an issue. So on uncertainty itself, I don't know whether you've thought about other measures of uncertainty, but it seems to me thinking about things like how the exchange rate reacted, or how stock prices reacted of different types of firms, depending on whether you're producing tradables or non-tradables, or a measure of the cost of credit for firms, right? So how much is it costing you more now to get access to credit to cover working capital costs? I think those are all alternative measures of uncertainty that might also be worth considering. And I think the Google Trends idea of capturing some of that, I think is a really good one. And what I would suggest there is, instead of focusing on the measures that you have now, is to focus more on searches that have to do with trade policy per se, right? So searches on regulation, mutual recognition, equivalence, but also searches that have to do with customs and customs controls. And how much does it actually cost? How much more time is it going to take me to get my good from A to B? So I would expect people in these firms to have been kind of using Google to get a sense of, okay, you know, what goes on in other markets on the logistics front, and so forth, right? So that might allow you to drill down a bit more in the area that you're really interested in, which is this trade policy uncertainty, as opposed to more general economic policy uncertainty. Let me stop there. Again, I think this is really interesting research, and I look forward to seeing what the final product is going to look like. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Bernard, and also Michael for his presentation. Bernard provided a host of rich comments that I think is fair for Michael to have an opportunity to respond to, first of all. So Michael, if you want to respond to some of Bernard's comments, then please do go ahead.
Great. Thank you very much. Bernard, thank you so much. Those are really, really great comments and incredibly useful. Let me also say, by the way, that Nico is also online. So Nico, if you want to come in with anything, feel free to do so. So if I can just quickly go through your points, because otherwise we are going to run out of time. You're absolutely right. This is only about trading goods, and that kind of links to your last point. It's also only about, to use your terminology, the downside risk associated with tariffs, and not about those other possible downside risks to do with regulations and so on. And it is something that we have thought about and would like to include. It's very hard to get product-specific, good-specific data on this. I mean, you mentioned the idea of regulation-intensive products. If you know of a database that gives me regulation, you know, some ranking of regulation-intensive products, I'd be delighted to hear about it, because I've been wanting to work with something like this for some time. So I completely agree with that. I also completely agree that the paper as written doesn't have that sort of clear conceptual or theoretical framework for thinking about it. In fact, it's something that Nico and I have been discussing. A lot of the paper is based around the idea of export uncertainty built on the work of Handling and Limauer, which is really about a model of heterogeneous firms with sunk costs and so on. And it's not obvious that that's the only way to think about this. You might argue that the threat of future higher tariffs might encourage firms to export more now in order to try and, you know, realize the value of their current production and exports, and that's not captured in the model and so on. So I completely agree that we need to go back and think about that and set out what we think are the mechanisms and channels. I also completely agree that you'd expect the effect on investment, but I think our time period is too short for that. Absolutely don't disagree with that. And the variation across product types is something that we've also discussed and are very keen to do. As you say, durable versus non-durable. You could think of intermediate versus final goods as well, distinction between. So thinking about how it might impact on different categories of goods, some sort of typology of products, is something that's already planned for. As for the Google Trends, thanks for those suggestions. I know that Nico worked very hard on trying all sorts of different ways of capturing uncertainty through Google Trends. So I don't know if Nico wants to add anything to that side of things.
Thank you, Michael. From the Q&A, I think Max Mendes had a question that very much echoed what Bernard has already been putting to you, which is, could the MFN tariff be playing a dual role as explanatory variable of the trade equation, as well as being a proxy for other uncertainties? I think you picked up that point. I mean, the expected value of something is a probability times the the expected outcome. And I think we sort of all agree now that, the change in the MFN is rather, as Bernard was saying, the downside risk, but it's not so much a measure of the uncertainty.
Agreed.
Can I take Bernard's investment remark to the goods trade realm? Is there a way of picking out intra-firm trade in a sense? Because you might think that intra-firm trade, and perhaps you can somehow capture this in the goods typology dimension, might be more affected or might be more resilient, as a case might be, to that type of uncertainty. And whilst we are at the product space, there are goods that are considered more data intensive than others, and there are typologies out there which I think you can try and separate goods where we would expect them to be more sensitive to others. Charlotte had a question about the implication of the reorientation of goods exports from the EU to other OECD non-FTA countries for the UK economy overall and for business sustainability. If you want to comment on that, please feel free.
Okay, so let me take that in reverse order back to Charlotte's question. Very good question. I guess it depends on the level of reorientation. In the sort of simplest or extreme way of thinking about it, if UK firms export less to the EU, but just manage to shift all those exports over to the FTA countries, and it's a sideways shift, as it were, then in that sense, there's not obviously necessarily any impact on the UK economy overall. But to the extent that there is some of that kind of trade diversion taking place, it's probably going to be a lot more complex than that. And as we saw with the work of Facundo yesterday, it looks like one of the ways that in the Argentinian context that firms were responding, they were responding by changing which products they exported. Now, if that impacts then on which products they produce and possibly sell domestically, then there could be an impact on the domestic economy. Max's question, I think, is a very good question as well, but I think I've already responded to that. Yes, the MFN tariff is clearly potentially a proxy for something more than that, and it would be really nice to be able to get a handle on that more than that, but it's thinking through what might be the appropriate data. And then Ingo, your question on intra-firm trade, it's a very nice thought, but it's not clear to me how we could operationalize this from a data point of view. We'd have to have some measure at a product level, I guess, of which products have higher degrees of intra-firm trade versus inter-firm trade. But it's an interesting thought, which I will go away and think about.
Yes, obviously, intra-firm trade is very difficult to convincingly operationalize if you just had trade data. That is true. But people have sometimes used features of the US economy where we have some more information, and then use this as a sort of product characteristic and transplanted it to other countries. So and there is work on the kind of intra-firm trade for US firms. Maybe that is could inform some robustness exercise.
Yeah, no, that's a nice thought. I mean, actually related to that, and something which the existing theory doesn't seem to deal with very much, and again, this goes back to Bernard's comments on the conceptual framework, is pretty much all this theory, trade theory, focuses on impact on exports. And there's very little work thinking about what might be the impact of uncertainty or downside risk on imports. And obviously you can think of imports as the other country's exports or the other firm's exports, but I don't mean it in that sense. I'm thinking about what might be the impact of uncertainty or downside risks on firms in integrated supply chains. And at the moment, I don't think there is much of a theory or conceptual framework that covers that, and it's something that we would like to think about. Yeah. I see, by the way, I've got one more question in the Q&A.
Yes, that is about, let me read it out for everyone else. And it's from Peru. Considering the current situation in trade policy trends, are the non-tariff measures important for the modeling processes? I think that harks back to something Bernard said. Clearly, the wedge between a preferential tariff or a zero tariff and the MFN is a measure of the downside risk in the tariff realm, but there might be all sorts of non-tariff barriers out there.
Yeah, so greetings back to Peru here. Yes, absolutely. Non-tariff measures not only could be important, but extremely likely to be important, and arguably, and the case could easily be made, may well be even more important, and across a wider range of goods. It's trying to figure out an appropriate way of capturing that is the challenge. Conceptually, I think you're absolutely correct.
Yeah, I think we're very nearly out of time. Let me perhaps close by relating something Alan Winters posted in the chat, that, you know, extensive margin is essentially about investment decisions. So, you know, maybe, you know, at least your results on the extensive margin, you know, could be indicative of something that Bernard thought, you know, really is important, and where the action is could be a clue. It is 10 to 3. Both of you, Michael and Bernard, do you want to have a final remark, final sentence?
Just a couple of thoughts. So on Alan's suggestion, I think insofar as there's investment associated with it, I think there we can differentiate between firms that already are at least exporting to one market, and the extensive margin question then is really, do we go into another market, as opposed to going from zero to exporting, right? And I think there, if you go from zero to exporting, clearly I would argue there's more of an investment dimension than if we're considering just to go into another market, which is more about marketing, trade promotion, what have you. That's something else to think about. I think on the regulation intensity and data, I can get back to you on that, but I think the point that Ingo made in terms of looking at services intensity, looking at data intensity, there are people who have been working on that. So one is Eric van der Madel at ULB, who has been doing this type of work. So I think there are some data sets out there where you can do what you can use, but we can do that bilaterally. Thanks.
I don't really have anything to add other than to say a big thanks to Ingo and to Bernard for the comments, and to everybody else's questions. Very, very useful. So thank you very much indeed.
Oh, thank you both, Michael, for your presentation, and Bernard for the very thoughtful comments. I think, Michael, you've got your work cut out for you. So that was a proof that it was a very useful session, and I hope for the audience as well. With that, we close this session. We're going to have a short break, comfort break, catch a coffee, and we'll be back at 2:55 with Alistair Smith chairing the next session. Thank you very much.